Hi there and welcome to the sew along for the bodysuit. So first of all, this is a knit fabric pattern and our seam allowances are 6mm, which is 1/4 inch. So when you're ready, thread up your overlocker with 4 threads of colour that match your fabric. Now the other thing is you are going to need access to a plain sewing machine, so make sure you have a ball needle inserted in that. That will just stop any fibres from being pierced. Now the main thing about the knit fabric you're going to need for this garment is it needs to have both horizontal and vertical stretch. So depending whether you're European or American, Americans would call that 4-way stretch and Europeans would call that 2-way stretch. So just remember you need both vertical and horizontal stretch, and it needs to have good stretch because there is what's called negative ease in this, which means the garment is made to fit to your body. Right, so the other thing we need to know is that when we're overlocking, because of the seam allowances, we're going to overlock on the raw edge of the fabric. Your blade does not need to cut anything off. And don't forget before you do start to run some spare fabric through your overlocker and your plain sewing machine just to test for tensions. Make sure your tensions are equal. Now you might like to lengthen your stitch length from normal on your sewing machine, and that will just allow a bit of extra give on the fabric. So the other thing is you're going to need a way of finishing the hems on the sleeves. So I'm just going to overlock and run 2 rows of plain stitching. If you have access to a cover stitch, that's great. If you have access to a plain machine with a twin needle, that's great too, because that will give you extra stretch. So there's quite a few versions of this garment you can sew. I'm going to sew the crossover wrap front. If you're sewing the scoop neck, it's pretty much the same as sewing any standard t-shirt, but you can watch the bits of the video that you might need to finish the crotch area off. The other thing is that this garment has so many options, I can't show you all of them. Just remember, if you're sewing 2 colours at the back or 2 different fabrics, top and bottom, just make sure you overlock the top and the bottom together of the front or the back before you go on and complete anything else. So make sure your front is one piece and your back is one piece before you continue. So I guess I'm going to sew the wrap version with the bell sleeve because it's probably the hardest version to do. Saying that, this isn't a hard sew, this is a very straightforward intermediate sew. So let's get started. To sew the belt loops, take one of the belt loop pieces, fold it right sides together lengthwise and overlock on the raw edge. Then take a loop turner and turn that through. Oops. And put that somewhere safe. To sew the tie, we're going to fold it right sides together lengthwise and overlock the raw edges together. Now we have to leave an area for turning, and it's entirely up to you where you want to leave that area for turning. Now try not to put the turn directly in the center because that ends up bulky when you're wearing it. What I like to do is just come up maybe a foot, 30 centimeters from one end, and then I leave a gap, and the gap I leave is maybe 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and then I start overlocking again. So when you're ready, now the fabric I'm making this with today is a double brushed poly spandex. It's very, very stretchy, and I have a cotton lycra as the contrast colour. Now, to make sure that this is sewn properly, there are notches to match as you go. Right, so I'm just going to trim back those threads a little, and then I'm going to turn this through. So when you've turned that through, just make sure you push out those edges, and you've got a nice sharpish point there. And now we need to close the gap that we created. So we're going to need access to a plain sewing machine for that. So the first thing you need to do is find that gap area, and what we need to do is just sort of hold it like that, and what will happen is the seam allowances will fold in. Now, our seam allowances are 6mm, which is 1/4 inch, but you can get away with a little bit more, up to 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 inch. Ideally not, but see how you go. So when you sew this, you have to be quite careful not to stretch it, or you end up with a wavy bit. And the other thing is, don't press it, because you'll end up stretching it out as well. I mean, press it if you really need to, but just try not to. So what we want to do is find one end of your overlocking like that, and we're going to edge stitch from just before there. And edge stitch is literally that. We're going to come with the folded edges together right on the very edge, and we want to stitch that. So it's only like maybe 2mm, which is like 1/8 inch, maybe even smaller. It's probably half of that actually, it's more like 1/16, but anyway. So make sure you back tack, and make sure you've test stitched this before you start as well. And don't stretch that out, as I said. And make sure you get right on the edge to close that gap. And back tack to finish. Okay, so go ahead and give that a press now, and put it somewhere safe, and we'll move on. Take one of the sleeves, and let's just look at the upper sleeve first. The sleeve has a notch at the top for the crown, and that sews to the shoulder seam, and then on one side there's a notch here, and that shows us the back of the garment. So there's a pair of sleeves. You cut one out this way and you cut one out that way, and some people call it a mirror. So take the upper sleeve like that and place it right side up, and then take the bell sleeve, and there's two and they're exactly the same, and the side that sews to the elbow area on the top is the side that has the notch in the middle there. It's the shorter side. So place those right sides together, and you'll find at the bottom of the sleeve there's a notch in the middle to match to the notch on the bell sleeve part. So all we're going to do is sew the seam right sides together, side to side. Make sure that centre notch matches. And you shouldn't need to stretch this at all, it should just sew in nice and neatly. So it's up to you now whether you sew this underarm seam together. I will, just to show you. I suppose it really doesn't matter, it just, sometimes it just gives a nicer finish. Personal preference. The main thing you need to make sure of is that that seam exactly matches when you're sewing it. And it should face towards the hemline. Right, so now you can go ahead and do the hem on that because it's nice and easy. I'm going to overlock and then do a row of plain stitching. So when we're sewing the hem here, you'll see a notch, and that notch is at 1.5 centimeters, which is 9/16 of an inch. And all we're going to do is turn that up and stitch through the overlocking at that height. And I'm going to sew a second row of stitches parallel to the first, just because I like the look of it, and I'm sewing them on the folded side. Right, so go ahead and do the same thing for the other sleeve. Now what I might do is just, I'll sew the other sleeve not all in one with the garment, so you'll be able to see both methods. And when you've done those sleeves, you can move on. So now's the time to talk about the back. You want to make sure the back is completed at this stage. So if you have a one piece, that's fine. If you're sewing a different fabric top to bottom, or you're using scraps to make it together, make sure you sew the seam at the centre. So at this stage, it's a really good idea to put the belt loops in. So what we're going to do now is tack stitch the belt loops into the side seam. So the position for the belt loops is the notch at the side seam, but if you've got a separate top and bottom that you've overlocked together, it's on that overlocking line, or but for the sake of too much bulk, you might like to put it just to one side of that overlocking line, maybe the top or the bottom. So what I'm going to do is fold my belt loops in half like this and place them on that notch position. I'm just going to put mine just slightly below, and I'm making sure that the seam of my belt loops faces towards the bottom of the garment, and I'm just going to tack stitch that into the side seam. Now I'm using, I'm around about 6mm, which is 1/4 of an inch. It really doesn't matter. When we sew up here, the seam is a 6mm seam allowance. So make sure that's either under 6mm, 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/8 of an inch, just whatever looks right for you. So when that's tacked into place, come to the other side. Oh, the other thing I should have mentioned is this is right side up. So you want to make sure it is right side up. So this is my top here and this is the bottom here. Just folding that in half, making sure those raw edges are even. And I'm just going to put that below that notch. It's really just so that that overlocker hasn't got so much bulk to deal with. Right, there we are. So the back's ready to go, and we're now going to work on the front. Actually, I told a lie, the back is not finished. The back is finished if you're sewing a band. If you're sewing the scoop neck or the round neck, you don't have to do this step, but if you're sewing the version with the wrap, we need to complete the upper neck area. So here is the top of our garment, and we're just going to seam from shoulder to shoulder the neck area. So what I'm going to do is overlock that curve Then I'm going to turn that over by 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch, and stitch that into place. Now if you have a twin needle or a cover stitch, now's the time to cover stitch that curve. So that's the back neckline. Okay, so this is wrong side up because I like stitching this from the wrong side, but we've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance here. If you find you get some tunnelling, drop that down to 6mm. It shouldn't make too much difference to the pattern. I mean, clearly it's not perfect, but it shouldn't. So what you need to do is turn that neckline over and stitch it into place. So yes, 1 centimetre seam allowance here unless you have issues with it, which is 3/8 of an inch. It really is fabric dependent. As you can tell, mine's gotten a little bit stretched out of shape. I might press that back into position. I'm not going to do another row of stitching. You can if you want. So this is just for the wrap version. As I said, for the other version you'll be sewing a band. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the front, the wrap part. So we've got 4 pieces for the upper front. We've got one cut out this way and that way for the outside, and then one cut out this way and that way, so 2 mirrors for the inside. So to make it easier to see, what I've done is I've cut my outside pieces in the floral and my lining or my inside pieces in that pinky colour. Right, so let's have a look at this piece here. So the curve here is the armhole, and what we're going to be doing soon is running a row of gathering stitches along the bottom. But the first thing we have to do is sew the centre front pieces together. So this long edge cut on the bias has a notch in the middle to help match. One thing when you're sewing knits, or any fabric that is on the bias, is this may stretch, so be very careful not to stretch it out. If you find it stretches out too much, you can cut a length of clear elastic, the length of that seam on the pattern piece, and overlock that in, and that will just help pull it back into place. So the clear elastic is also called Mobilon, and try and go for something like about a 6mm or a 1/4 of an inch, and that will help stabilise that seam. So much information. Okay, so take one of the pieces. Now this is my left front as I'm wearing it, and the outside, and make sure you find the lining piece that is the same, and put them right sides together. And when you have those pieces right side together, we're going to overlock this long seam here, making sure the notch at the centre matches. Now be very careful if you sew 2 different types of fabric like I am, that you get that notch in the correct place. And then go ahead and repeat that for the other piece. Alright, so when you've got both pieces done, turn them so that they are right side out. And we're going to run a row of gathering stitches. So move over to your plain sewing machine. Alright, so now we're working on the gather part. So here is the angle up here, and here is the waist seam here. Place these pieces wrong side together. So we've turned it out like this. And along the bottom edge here you'll see some notches. The first one's 2 inches, round about that in from the side there, and then as we come along there's another one here which is in the centre. The first thing we need to do is put those notches on top of each other. And that shows us where the gathering line is going to run between. So you probably won't need to change the stitch length at all like you normally would do for a woven. If you feel you do, that's fine too. Right, so at around about 6mm, 1/4 of an inch or foot width, starting on that notch, I'm just going to pull a nice long piece of thread and making sure my raw edges are even. I'm going to run a line of stitches, which is going to be my gather. So it's quite important at this stage that those raw edges are together. So that's 6mm, 1/4 of an inch. So go across to the next notch, and that's the stop position. And then run some thread off, like so. Now I always find it easier to gather from the wrong side, so I'll turn it over, entirely up to you though. I'm going to pull a thread through, because we only ever pull gathering from one side, and I'm just going to gently pull that through, like so, and then I'll come to the other end and pull some threads in as well. At this stage we don't know how much gather we're going to need, so just start it off like that and make sure it's reasonably even, although we're going to fiddle with it in a moment. So do exactly the same to the other piece. Alright, so before we move on to the next step, we've got a little bit of rearranging to do. So put the pieces right side up, and this is the left side as we're wearing it. And then take your other piece and cross them over, and this is the right side as if we're wearing it. So what we want to do is come here, and we want to match the notches in the center, like that. So when you have that in the correct position, put a pin in it to hold it. So the next position we want is the very edge here is going to sit on the notch here at the far end, like that. I'll pop a pin there, and then come to the other side over here, and those two notches there are going to be the position for where the underlayer sits there. And hold that into place. So what we have to do now is adjust our gathers to fit. Now don't pull them from the front if you haven't pulled them from the front. What I'm going to do is just pull them from the back, because that's the side I did the gathers from. If you pull them from the wrong side, you'll end up with knots. I'm just going to pull that in a little bit firmer until that all sits well like that, and then come to the underside here and do exactly the same thing. Just going to pull it a little bit closer. Now we will have to adjust these again slightly when we overlock the lower half. Alright. Now if you're uncomfortable with overlocking this all together, now's the time to run some tack stitching through. By that I mean run a line of tack stitching 6mm on that side. So I'll show you what we're going to do if you do decide to do that, and that will just help you hold the layers together. And there are a number of layers to go through, so just match the side seam there. And I'm just going to sew that at foot width, which is close enough to 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so that will just help hold things together. You may need to adjust it more, but we'll see how we go with the overlocker. So now we're going to sew the upper front to the lower front, and this is the same for either view. So if you're sewing a scoop neck front, upper front to the lower front, it's exactly the same thing. So place the pieces right sides together and match the notches. So this is what we're doing here, and you'll find along the top of the bottom piece, if that makes any sense whatsoever, there are notches that will match to the positions that we sewed those gathers to. So it could be a little awkward, so the easiest thing to do is just start at one edge and overlock. And that'll just free your hands up a bit, and it'll just anchor everything into place. So come along and find the centre position and match that centre notch to the notches here. I'll just put a wee pin in. So all it is now is a matter of making sure all those raw edges are even and just ease that into place. It may be a little bulky, so just be careful. Now same thing as the front, if that gets stretched too far out of place, you can put Mobilon, which is clear elastic, into that seam to help stabilise it. So before you go any further, just check your work and make sure everything's caught, and make sure there's no tack stitches showing. Right, so now I'm going to sew the shoulders. So this is my back piece, and you remember how I said before it was slightly wavy? Well, with a good press it's smoothed itself back out and will back into the correct position, and that's great. So this is the back right side up, and we want to sew it to the front shoulder position. So what we're going to do is place the front to the back so it's right sides together like that. And we'll start on the shoulder here, which is the left as you're wearing it. Now to get a nice transition, what I'm going to do is, instead of just overlooking across those 3 layers, which you can do if you want, I'm just going to sandwich that piece into place. So what I've got is right sides together. So there's my back, there are my fronts, and what I'm going to do is just wrap this around like that. So the back is sandwiched between the fronts, and I'm just going to rearrange it so that that neck seam is right butted in beautifully. And then once I'm happy with that, I'm going to overlock that together. Now I'm going to start from the sleeve side, the armhole area, that does, when we turn it through, is it gives you this lovely smooth transition. And you push all those little bits out of the way from the front to the back neckline. Needs a good press, but that's what it does. It gives you just a smooth, seamless transition, and you don't have that overlocking line shown. Right, so when you've done that on one side, do the same thing for the other. So I have it right sides together like that. And then I'm just wrapping the lining to the back. And this is where you're going to feel a bit like you've got butterfingers. It can be a bit awkward, but once you get those first couple of stitches out of the way, then you can rearrange that nice and easily. You just pull the middle in so it's buttered through. And there's your other shoulder seam there. Right, so that is the stage we're up to now. Right, so I mentioned earlier I was going to show you both ways of doing the sleeve, the set-in sleeve and then the sleeve with the side seam all sewn in at once. So let's start off with the side seam sewn all in one with the sleeve. So this is pretty much the one you can use regardless. It's an easy way of sewing in your sleeve into the armhole. So place your garment right side up. So this is my front and this is my back. And take the sleeve and place it right sides together into the armhole area. So we're looking for the notch at the very centre of the top, which is called the crown notch, and that notch needs to match to that seam we've just sewn there. On the back there will be a notch here, and that matches to the notch on your sleeve. So the first thing we're going to do is match the beginning. So place your two front pieces together there. So this is the side seam and this is the armhole. Place that to the curve of the sleeve. We want all three raw edges together. And just overlock a short way. Once you've done that, the rest of this should be relatively easy, well, straightforward anyway. So with sleeves there should be no ease from the underarm a short way up, and all the ease should be from the back pitch point towards the crown notch, but depends on the pattern, of course. I'm making a broad generalisation. So anyway, once you have secured the beginning there, just ease in the fullness, making sure by the time you get to that crown notch all the fullness is taken up, and we want all three raw edges together. Okay, before you go any further, just check your work and make sure it's all caught and all nice and smooth. And then we're going to sew that side seam. So rearrange your work so you're at the wrist edge, and this won't make any difference whether it's the straight sleeve or this bell sleeve. Just match the wrist area. want those seams facing towards the wrist and sitting directly on top of each other. So we're going down, transitioning through to the back now. Sorry, we're transitioning through to the side seam, going towards the centre back, well, towards the waist area. Now, if you've put the belt loops in, we're going to be going over them shortly, so just make sure you go slowly so your overlocker blade doesn't break, because there are a few layers to go through there. And then continue down the side seam. So now just go ahead and complete the sleeve hem. And this will be the same for whichever sleeve you're sewing. There's a 1.5 centimetre, which is 9/16 of an inch hem allowance. Now to do the set-in sleeve, what we're going to do is place the garment right sides together and sew the side seam before we sew the sleeve in. So we're sewing the sleeve, I think some people call it sewing in the round. I like it because I think it gives a better result, but it's entirely up to you. So let's just sew that side seam first. We want the 3 layers together, and we're sewing on the raw edge, matching the waist notch and being very careful about the belt loop. So here is my garment, wrong side out. Here's the side seam. And here is my sleeve, right side out. So all I'm going to do is put that sleeve in there. The first thing we do is match the underarm seam to the side seam and hold it in place. Then you want to find that crown notch, which is the notch at the top of the sleeve. There's mine, and we want to match that to the shoulder seam. And then at the back there will be a notch, and that matches to the sleeve notch there. So when you overlock this, don't start anywhere near the top. It's a good idea to start just one side of the underarm. Apart from the fact it hides the bulk, it just makes it look a little bit tidier. And the other thing is, if you have one of these removable arms, it might help you sewing with that off. And the last thing, it's a good idea to do that sewing with the sleeve on top. So you might need to rearrange your work. So I'm just going to go and turn this so it makes it easier to sew. I'm going to overlock the crotch area. because for this one I'm going to attach the snaps directly to the garment. So with the elastic, cut the length that's indicated on the pattern for the size you're sewing. There's a mark which is the side seam. The shorter edge is the front. So this gets overlocked to the wrong side. And then repeat that on the other side. Okay, so we're going to stitch this into place. So here are the notches here for the turn position. Now you could put some fuse under here or some sort of reinforcing for your snaps. And now finish the sleeve hems off. Here's the notch position at 1.5 centimeters, which is 9/16 of an inch. So that's it, we've finished. All that remains now is for you to go and get your snaps and put them into the crotch area here, evenly spaced, with a cam press or something similar, or you could hand sew snaps on if you'd rather. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and also join my Facebook pattern discussion group where you'll get advanced notification of new products, calls for pattern testers and also sales. See you again soon.